Hello, and thank you for giving me the chance of talking about something that has been quite a phenomenal media event over the last couple of months for me. But I think of greater importance is the way that it talks about how a museum can engage with a community, even if that community isn't local to the museum. So what I'd like to do to start with is to show you a video that was put out by the university at the same time the media release went out announcing the decision to return a Benin bronze from the University Museum's collection. And I'd like to show it for two reasons. One is it gives a bit of background to the history of Benin bronzes and how the one in Aberdeen was acquired. It also is something worth thinking about in terms of media. So the language used, the story that we were telling, and I'll refer to this later. But if you have a start, watch this, and apologies for the music. So here we go. So the university has decided that it is right that this be returned to Benin City, to Nigeria, and to return it with no conditions. This is something that will become their property, and they will decide what to do. It was actually unusual in a sense for them to be faced with a museum that was interested in talking about the future rather than resisting. So we've had a very good discussion. The next steps will be in discussion with them. So the story clearly was announced at the end of March this year, and unlike as was suggested in one television panel discussion I saw, it wasn't in response to the announcement by Germany that they would be returning things. 2 days would have been too quick. This is something that took well over 2 years, and indeed has a story much longer than that. That the first time that the university's been involved in a repatriation was back in 2002, 2003. The unusual thing with this particular decision was that it was led by the university. That the first step was trying to find somebody in Benin City that we could talk to and discuss who it should be returned to. The other cases have been responsive, have been in, when there's been a claim put in by somebody else for the return of something in the collection. So back in 2002, the first time I was involved with this was a request by the Horn Society of the Kainai Nation, the Blood Tribe in Canada, and they were wanting to return a sacred bundle that we had catalogued as a headdress and trailer. And so we saw it as an artifact, and their argument was no, this was a sacred item. It wasn't really a thing at all. And we discussed this and decided that it should indeed be returned. But we didn't just have a decision as quickly as that. We devised a procedure for considering a claim, and this was based on experience from other museums. I really want to emphasise the way this is not a unique thing. Aberdeen is not particularly leading, that there are many museums that are thinking about how they engage with communities, and that repatriation is part of that. But we devised criteria and a procedure. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about that just now, before maybe thinking about this particular return. So the the discussion takes place primarily within an advisory group. Ultimately, the decision is made by the university court. They're the body that is officially the university. They own the property. They're responsible for the institution. But they've delegated the discussion to an advisory group, and this is the makeup of the group that decided to return the Benin bronze. So it's convened by a vice principal, and then there are a group of standing members who are there to consider any repatriation request, and then a group who are brought into the advisory group with specific expertise and specific knowledge for the particular case. So as you can see, that the standing membership includes myself and the Director of Digital Information Services, who's my boss, who's the Museum's Special Collections is within Digital Information Services. And then Alison Brown, who's a professor in social anthropology with experience of working with museums and communities, particularly indigenous communities in North America, and about repatriation and similar co-curation and collaboration. And then we have a representative of the university court. A lay member just means that they're not a member of the university staff, who is, because the principal is a member of court, for example. And that means that the interests of the institution are considered in this discussion, not just of the collections or anything like that. And then the co-opted members, in this case we drew on two other members of staff in the university. Richard Anderson, who is a lecturer in history, whose research focuses on the history of West Africa and the history of the transatlantic slave trade. And then Sula Kasim, who is, a lecturer in energy economics, who's worked in Nigerian universities and indeed himself is Nigerian. So he brought another local perspective on this. We make sure that we're not doing it in isolation. So we always have somebody from another museum in Scotland. In this case, we approached Steph Colton, who is director of the Hunterian and is also a member of the International Council of Museums Ethics Committee. So this keys us into broader thinking. And then I think the most unusual feature of our repatriation procedure is that we ask that the claimant nominates a member of the panel. And so in this case, Bankole Sadipo was our main contact in Nigeria, and so he became a member of the panel. So the idea is the discussion is consensual, it explores all aspects, and it then makes a recommendation which goes to the university senior management team, that's the principal and vice principals and so on. And in this case, they agreed that unanimously and passed it on to the university court for approval, who then approved it, and that was what we were announcing at the end of March, was that decision by the university court. So this process actually took over 2 years, and most of that time was actually spent trying to assemble the right people in Nigeria. In this case, the claim came from the Nigerian federal government and their National Museums and Monuments Commission, along with the Edo State governor. Nigeria is a federal state, so Edo State is where Benin City lies. And incidentally, of course, the modern country that is Benin is nothing to do with this. It's a neighbour of Nigeria, but we're talking about Benin City, which is in Edo State in Nigeria. And the other partner in this, very important, was the court of the Oba, the traditional king of Benin City and the Kingdom of Benin. So that took quite a while to get to assemble the right people to support the claim that we were then able to discuss. The other aspect of our procedure is the discussion that we take. So we have a series of criteria, and these are not prescriptive criteria. They're not saying that you must demonstrate that, say, the claimant is a lineal descendant of somebody, or that there's continuation of traditional practice. Instead, it's a way of structuring the discussion. They're educative criteria. They're ways of encouraging discussion so that we explore all aspects. So, to work through them, the first one, of course, is, are we all talking about the same item? And closely related to that is finding out about the history of the item. What is this? How has it come to be in Aberdeen? And in this case, we actually had some information ourselves that it was purchased by the university in Sotheby's in 1957, but we really didn't know before that who had it. So we were helped here by Alex Tweedy of Lyon and Turnbull, the auctioneers, and he was able to track down and amazingly found an advert for a sale in 1927, an advert in the Burlington magazine. And the image used to advertise this sale was the head of an Oba that's now in Aberdeen. And so this linked us directly. This was a sale of items from Benin City from the looting that took place in 1897. So we were able to show that clear link. So we knew that it was one that was looted. And I think in this case, it was this criterion that was the most important one, that led us to feel that although the university had legal title, and that meant that it was able to return them, if the university didn't own it, then it couldn't have made the decision. Pardon me. But that we really didn't have moral title, that it was the basis was looting, was theft. In other cases which we've considered, this has been less important. Sometimes there was no particular dispute about ownership. The question was more about whether it was what was the appropriate way of treating an item today. So that first case, for example, the important thing was returning the sacred bundle into traditional use as part of sort of cultural regeneration. So it was more to go down to the fourth criterion, the significance of the item, that was most important there. That in that case, the sacred bundle was clearly more important to the claimant than it was as an item of Plains ethnography. So we were able there to decide, although it was of some significance to the university, it was of greater significance to the claimant. We also discuss that connection, and this is often about who is making the claim. So with the first case I mentioned, the claim came from the Horn Society of the Kainai Nation, so it's directly the people who were going to be putting this back into use. Another case we considered was the return of Maori ancestral remains, and the claim here came from Te Papa Tongarewa, which is the Museum of New Zealand, the National Museum. And they initially showed us a letter mandating them by the New Zealand government to be able to claim these. But we also asked them to prove that they were also able to represent the Maori iwi, the Maori tribes, and that they were able to do, so that link was clear, because it's very important that you are giving something back to the right people. And this, again, in the case of the Benin bronze, is why I felt it was important to build that collaborative claim, that it wasn't a choice between the Oba of Benin or the state government or the federal nation and its national museums. Note with the final two criteria that we talk about to the claimant and to the university. So in this discussion, we're trying not to presume anything, and certainly the claimant shouldn't be in the position of having to justify to the museum why the status quo should be breached. Instead, we try to have it as an open discussion, so, of what significance is it to the claimant and to the university? What would happen if it was returned, both in the university and to the claimant? And what would happen if it was retained by the university? So we think through all those possible, logically there's 4 outcomes there. What would be the outcome? And we can then discuss all these aspects and come to, hopefully, a consensual conclusion, which has been the case to date. And indeed, while I think repatriation is really important and really, is a key thing for museums to address, it's something that, we've been looking after these collections for a purpose, And I think the purpose that we've been looking after them may be to now return them to the descendants of the people they were originally taken from or given by, indeed. So it's, it is very important. At the same time, since 2003, we've only considered, I think it's about five cases. It's not a frequent occurrence, and I don't think it ever will be. I think the effort taken to put together a claim, to consider it, really shows how much an item matters to somebody, whether it is the actual remains of their ancestors, or whether it is a sacred item or a culturally important item. I think it's something about importance and significance, rather than people thinking about just they want everything from a particular place. I mean, for example, I remember I've seen both in Paris and I think in New York examples of Charles Rennie Mackintosh furniture, and my immediate feeling wasn't to feel, oh, those should be returned to Scotland. It was to feel quite pleased to see Scottish material in international museums, and I think that's the case for many people. I think, as an example, it actually is about Egypt, that Egyptian archaeology. I think people in Egypt and the Egyptian government are very pleased that there is Egyptian material on display around the world, because it drives an interest which actually leads to tourism and has an economic benefit to Egypt. So it's not a sort of let's empty out museums. I think this is one particular way of engaging with people. So the criteria, I think, are quite valuable because they are educative, because they're about encouraging discussion. And where this worked, and particularly, and we're going through the Benin bronze case, where in some institutions this has been more contentious, and in the university it really wasn't. And I think that's partly because it aligns so clearly with the institution's values, which we've been discussing a lot recently. And the university has not, basically last year announced its new strategic plan, a 20-year plan. And this is given as a basis, and I'm not usually one for showing corporate slides, but I think this one is actually quite useful. So the university is wanting to be inclusive, interdisciplinary, international, and sustainable. And if you think about our decision, it really does strike at all of these in some way. The other important feature is the statement open to all and dedicated to the pursuit of truth in the service of others. This is described as the university's foundational purpose. It's a rewording of the letter that Bishop Elphinston wrote to the Pope in 1494, requesting the establishment of a university in Aberdeen. When he was writing, he was thinking of it as an institution that would primarily be training priests for the north of Scotland. So what we're actually doing is quite different. The language is different. The institution, indeed, is very different. But I think there is a sense in which these values are very relevant today. And indeed, when I was talking about the repatriation and the media announcements and interviews and so on, I felt it was very important that we emphasised that this decision was based on the idea of the truth, that we weren't trying to make a political gesture. This was dealing with the truth of what had happened, that this was loot, therefore logically it should no longer be the university's property. And it was in the service of others that we were doing this for the benefit of the people in Benin City and in Nigeria. So that alignment of values, I think, was really significant in the decision making. That meant that there was no disagreement, no opposition, and yet we were able to discuss things really quite thoroughly. So when it came to the media announcement, we knew this was going to be big. We knew it would really be quite a popular story. I have, however, genuinely been surprised by quite how much interest there's been. I'm still getting, radio and TV interviews that were now, initially it was very much focused on the story, that quite tight story. We're now thinking the interviews are more about reflecting on the process and the implications, and a slightly richer discussion of what went on. So there are a number of videos around, available on the web. You can see some of them I've highlighted here. There was I think the longest two interviews I've been involved with so far were for Channel 4 News and Al Jazeera's programme The Stream. which went into it in greater detail. It was really striking, of course, how almost all news outlets just repeated word for word what went out in the university media statement. And so this idea of us talking about the truth of the word loot being used, of being really making quite strong statements about the immorality of the original acquisition, were just repeated in most media statements. There were a few that picked up, The Guardian in particular, picked up a story and tied it in with what was going on particularly in Germany and in other museums around the UK. But definitely had quite an impact, and the same applied in social media. And I think 2 or 3 days after the announcement, there was we got a report on the social media impact, and these are some of the headlines from that. And you can see some of these numbers are phenomenal. 41.3 million impressions. That is a big number. Notice the coverage, the popularity, that particularly the UK was naturally the main interest, followed by the US, followed by Nigeria. And actually I was quite struck that it didn't have quite the impact in Aberdeen that the discovery before Christmas, the announcement we put out about discovering a small fragment of wood from the Great Pyramid that Abir Eladin is going to be talking about in ARP. And so it didn't have quite the same local resonance as it has done internationally, and obviously particularly in Nigeria, but across the world. And looking at the social media response, there's an algorithm was trying to pick up, was this a positive response or negative or neutral? And so they look at particular words in the context of the language of the social media responses, and so you can see in this sort of heat cloud the main words, and there's also an indication of sentiment, from fear and anger and joy and so on. And overall, I think joy was the main sentiment. But interestingly, it says the average was more or less, 50-50. And that, I think, actually underrepresents slightly the positivity of it. And that's because the algorithm, when it detected words like loot and extremely immoral, it used those as negative, whereas in fact those were words that were used in the media release, and so I think they should be seen as actually a positive response, that they were just straightforwardly following what the university had said. And in a way, I think this is what I've been particularly pleased with in the response, is that it has been broadly positive, but actually fundamentally has been pretty neutral. You see those big words: Nigeria, University of Aberdeen, Benin bronze. That says it. And that, I think, I was particularly interested. The London Times chose this for a leading article. That they described it as, I think, something that seemed eminently fair and reasonable. And I think that was real success. That what I think we may have succeeded in doing with this is making the return of Benin bronze seem pretty uncontentious and pretty logical and straightforward, rather than being something feeding into any culture wars. So although there were a few responses that were of that ilk, really the story has been remarkably flat, and that, I think, has been really good, that we're doing it, and that's the important thing, rather than making great claims about it. So it's been very interesting. So in conclusion, I think I'd like to emphasize that point, that this has been a simple story about the truth. If you want to read more, there have been 2 books published in basically the last 6 months or so. The first one came out was The Brutish Museums by Dan Hicks, and you can see the cover here and how very cleverly it plays on the design of a British Museum poster, and that's because the largest collection of Benin bronzes is in the British Museum, and they have tended to be resistant to returning them permanently, are now discussing a loan or discussing collaboration, with people in Edo State to create a new museum, the Edo Museum of West African Art. I think Dan Hicks' book has been described as the case for the prosecution. It's a very strongly and clearly worded statement of why museums in the West should not have these and why it's a continuation of colonial violence. Barnaby Phillips brought out a book, Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes, more recently. And his one is worth reading because he was a BBC correspondent in Nigeria for quite a number of years, and so his book goes more into what has happened in Nigeria, so it, I think, gives a richer picture of where they would be returned to and the reasons why they're wanted back, and some of the arguments within Nigeria about how they should be treated. So I'd particularly recommend that. But I think my main closing comment is actually to think that we've got to be very careful that we don't focus too much on this is a story about museums, and instead we should be thinking more about Benin City, and we should be, and this is a general point about repatriation and indeed all work with communities, that we should be putting the communities ahead of the museums, and thinking about why are people wanting to have things returned? What do they want them returned for? And how will they treat them? So in the case of the return of the Benin bronze from the University of Aberdeen, we returned it with no conditions. So it's up to them to decide, what they want to do, and indeed it's up to them to decide when and how it's going to be returned. So as I speak, it's still in Aberdeen. We're waiting for the legal title to be transferred and then the item physically to be transferred. And likewise, a celebration of its return. We won't be running a celebration in Aberdeen. Instead, we'll be supporting anything that is wanted from Nigeria. I think we've had plenty of publicity out of this. We don't need to push any more. I think it would be in some ways quite tasteless to try to claim any more out of it. So I think that it's likewise that first return. They invited me to the Sundance the following year to see the headdress danced for the first time in its traditional way since it had been returned, the first time since I think the early 1920s. And when I saw it danced, it was about 50 centimetres shorter than when it left Aberdeen. The trailer down the back had a bit cut off it. And that was because the man who was wearing it, who was dancing it, was a wee man, so he'd have tripped over if it had still been the original length. And so that was the appropriate way of looking after it, not a museum way. And indeed they commented that physically we'd looked after it well, but not spiritually. So I think letting an item completely escape from the museum world, not demanding that it carry on be looked after in the way that museums do, it followed through the logic of why this should be returned. So in both cases, I think we've been trying to respond to the demands of the people who have that strong claim. And I think just now there is a sort of golden moment for the Benin bronzes, that while in the West we have museums who have been thinking much more about how they work with communities and much more reflective and responsive. I think clearly the impact of Black Lives Matter has also brought this to the fore, particularly African material. And then in Africa, and particularly in Benin City, there has been a great emphasis on trying to create a new context, this new museum of West African art that they're hoping to build, to give a way in which they can look after these items in a way that they feel is appropriate and gives them adequate care. So all those things coming together, I think, makes it a really good moment. And I suspect that the reason that Aberdeen has appeared to come first in the decisions was actually partly because it was a good first step, because it was a single item, a very straightforward one to discuss. And so I think this is something that from the Nigerian point of view, it was quite a good one to do first. So we are definitely responding there. Although we may initially have made the first contact, they decided to pick this one up and go with it. So hopefully I'll be able to tell you a continuing story in the future about how this has returned, and whether there's any continuing contact, and what we're going to do. And it would be nice to think of some of the other collections we have from Nigeria in particular. How can we discuss them and maybe curate them in more interesting ways, and make links between Aberdeen and Benin City in a positive way, not one of one-sided loot, but one much greater interchange. So thank you very much.